Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I thought what I'd do today is, whilst I've got 10 minutes away from the computer, is to do a very quick video with regard to a couple of messages which I've received from YouTube, from a couple of users on YouTube, with regard to the setting up of a hi-fi component system. And they're from Steve and also from Matt. And they're really interesting inquiries because both Steve and Matt have got the basis of really quite good vintage hi-fi systems. And I quite like giving advice on this because it takes me back to the days that I was helping people select their hi-fi components in the mid to late 1980s when working in department stores in the UK. And I was really interested to get an email from Steve, who has got the very turntable that I used to own in the early to mid 1980s, which is a Technics SLT2. Okay, so the amplifier which Steve was discussing, the SUA 700, was one of those peculiarities as well, that it was one of the first designed which Matsushita launched as Class AA. Okay, so we know about Class A amplification gives you a whopping great power output as well as a great linearity. So in other words, little distortion, whatever volume you're driving your speakers at. Now, Class AA amplification was something which was derived by Matsushita and effectively added front end Class A and rear end Class B. Now, I don't truly understand why any design of amplifier would do that. But saying that is the components that created it were discrete. So in other words, there wasn't, if you like, a stage one and a stage two of amplification. It was all done within the same logic and circuitry. Now, what I do understand is that by the reduction in the transformer, the heat sinks and the capacitors, is a Class AA amplifier can give you increased power output at the same time as decreasing power input. So they were much more efficient. And some would say that they emit less heat than the Class A amplifiers, which I've spoken about before. And I think that's probably the case. And certainly a lot of Class AA amplifiers don't need big heat sinks, and they also don't need any fans to cool them down. So that would suggest that they're actually using less power consumption. And a lot of reviews that I've read about Class AA amps is that they can really drive speakers well. So it doesn't matter if you're using 4 ohm or 8 ohm loudspeakers, you turn the volume up maybe 25%, and you really do hear the difference. Now, I've not had an issue with Class A amps ever, but I understand that Class AA amplifiers give you that added bit of welly as well as efficiency. So I think, Steve, you've got a really good, really quite nice basic direct drive turntable with a good, solid Technics Class AA amplifier, which is, you know, it's given good servicing and that you don't mess it up by shorting out the speaker connections, for argument's sake, that's going to give you another, 5 years service or thereabouts without any maintenance. And also you've got a pair of KEF Q350 speakers. Now, KEF speakers are not something that I've had much knowledge of on since I was selling hi-fi, as I say, back in the mid-1980s. And certainly in those days, the KEF Coda speakers were some of the finest loudspeakers anywhere on the market, and sold an awful lot of them. So what I understand about the KEF Q350s is they're not only really easy to drive, so your Technics amplifier is really going to suit those down to the ground, good welly output into very efficient loudspeakers, but they're also really good speakers for a majority of different types of music. So they'll work with something plinky plonky as well as something really quite heavy, sort of thrash metally. So I think you've got a pretty good setup there. And I think, you know, you've asked the question as to how you could improve it, and interested in my opinion as to how you could improve it. Well, actually, if you're looking for a system to play records, then you don't need to improve it too much. If you're looking to add additional peripherals into this, whether or not they be digital, such as a CD player or DAT deck, or an analog component such as cassette deck or open reel, then that's a different subject, and I'm more than happy to help you choose one of those items. Just drop me an email at any time. But what I would say is that if you've got a large vinyl record collection, which appears you have, then that turntable and that amplifier combination with those speakers is going to give you a damn good output. And I do envy you a little bit, because I remember how good that turntable was. But just have a quick look at your stylus and cartridge on there, just to make doubly sure. Now, Matt's emailed about a really interesting conundrum, and this is something that really interests me, because he's asked me for my opinion on speakers. Now, I'm no expert on some of the latest loudspeakers on the market. And the reason why I'm sort of opting out of the question about speakers and my recommendations are that I know quite a lot about vintage tech. But when it comes to more modern designs of loudspeakers, I know that I've mentioned things to friends and to clients in the past, and they've shot me down in flames, because a lot of the brands that I recognize from my knowledge of vintage hi-fi are not quite as good as they used to be in the past. So, for argument's sake, a couple of years ago, I bought some Wharfedale bookshelf speakers, which I've mounted on 18-inch stands in the shed. Now, I think they perform really well, but they've come in for an awful lot of criticism in the market, because they simply don't match the performance of loudspeakers which carry the Wharfedale name in the past. So my recommendations for products will always direct people towards older quality components. Unfortunately, loudspeakers are one of those weird areas of vintage hi-fi, because so many loudspeakers have been damaged in transit, as it were. So many loudspeakers have been knocked around in house moves. They may have got bass or treble tweeters that have been damaged by poor quality amplification, or just cranking up the volume too high in the past. And of course, a lot of components in loudspeakers have degraded over time as well. So you tend to get a lot of noisy bass drivers, particularly when they wobble around if you're putting analog sources through them. And tweeters as well tend to degrade over time. And I've spoken to a few people recently about replacing components in loudspeakers with original brand new old stock components. And apparently this is quite a big thing for a lot of loudspeaker producers. So I'm going to do a video on that with hopefully a service engineer at some point in the future. But for now, I'm not going to talk about recommending loudspeakers to go with a system. Although the question you ask, Matt, is about an old Panasonic amplifier that you've got, which is an SU2700. Well, that's an amplifier I know quite well. And the reason being is the chassis of that model is the same chassis as what was seen on the SUV2 Technics amplifier, which I reviewed a couple of weeks ago, which is for sale over on the Facebook page. Now, the 2700, I understand, isn't a Class A amplifier, but it was one of the final National Panasonic branded amps before they rebranded as Technics in the UK. And as I say, it's got a really good chassis, a very good set of components within it. But if it hasn't been looked after, then you may need to think about having it recapped with someone who can do that. Now, I understand that age of tech, as in before Class A amplification, can be damaged if the components aren't matched perfectly. So you're sort of taking this into your own area of advice at the moment. My advice would be to plug it into your loudspeakers and your turntable, which I'll come on to in a moment, and just see if you like the sound quality. Now, if not, as a non-serviced amplifier, in other words, if it works, but you could sell it as unserviced, you'd probably get 50 or 60 pounds for that amplifier. It's a good looking piece of kit. It might even sell to a set designer or something like that, because it is a very iconic design. Silver fronted, toggle switch with VU meters. Really nice design, and actually was a good quality amp for its time as well. So if it works, then hold on to it. But match it with a pair of loudspeakers. This particular amp's got 40 watts per channel into 8 ohms. So a majority of loudspeakers, whether vintage or modern, will be able to handle the output from that amp. But always have in your mind that the speakers that you buy should also be readily compatible with another amplifier which you may buy in the future, that being a new amp or indeed a second-hand vintage amp as well. So always make sure that you've got enough headroom in those speakers to take a power output of a new amplifier. In other words, don't match 40 watts per channel with your Panasonic to a 40 watts RMS input on a pair of loudspeakers. But you also mentioned that you've got a Sanyo TP1020 turntable. Now, a lot of people will know that Sanyo and Fisher weren't seen as prime manufacturers of hi-fi equipment in their time, but they were good quality Japanese components. And this particular turntable, the motor within this turntable was actually made by Matsushita. So it was a Technics stroke Panasonic motor within a Sanyo deck. So this turntable should give you many moons of additional service, but it definitely will need looking at from a cartridge and stylus perspective. And again, I will take a closer look at this, but this turntable is not worth more than about 40 or 50 pounds. So if you need to spend 50 to 70 pounds on a cartridge and stylus, then you may be better to sell this as parts and spares, but to buy then a good quality, solid direct drive turntable, such as the SLD2, which I mentioned before, following that query from Steve. So the turntable's a bit like that for me. It's whether or not you want to spend the money on that particular item. My thoughts is that you should probably tidy it up, pop it onto eBay, get 50 or 60 pounds for it, but then look for a good quality direct drive turntable. Use that then in partnership with your Panasonic amp, providing it's working okay. If it is, keep that for as long as you want to, but then think about upgrading maybe to a Panasonic, a Technics or JVC amplifier, Sony amp in the future, but we can talk on that one separately. And as I say, then you mentioned about loudspeakers. Well, for me, always look for a pair of good quality vintage speakers if you can. But again, as I say, the problems are that a lot of these speakers have become old, like myself, but also you might have to travel to go and collect them because of obviously they're big old units and a lot of people won't deliver. So you may find the ideal loudspeakers, but then you can't actually get them into your home. But if you'd like some advice on buying vintage loudspeakers, then let me know. I'm more than happy to do a video on that and some of the best loudspeakers that you could buy, certainly from the 80s and 90s. I'm more than happy to do a video on that separately. So if anyone's got any queries or any questions at all, you're more than happy to send me a message on YouTube or send me a message on Facebook, and I'll always try and help. But to Steve and Matt, thanks for being my first direct enquiries via YouTube. I've got to learn somewhere, and I hope this video has been useful in both your queries and also if the wider audience are looking for a vintage hi-fi system to put together in the near future. So let me know if it's been useful. Otherwise, I will be in touch very soon. Cheers. Bye.